Chapter 1. Introduction. The Origin of the West Frankish Empire. The history of Europe is full of turning points where empires emerge, transform, and finally take on new shapes. One of these decisive moments was the emergence of the West Frankian Empire in the 9th century. Step by step, it developed into what we know today as France. But the roots of this empire do not lie in a sudden new beginning, but in the legacy of an empire that had shaped all of Europe, the Empire of Charlemagne. When Charlemagne was crowned emperor by Pope Leo III in Rome in 800, the idea of a united West seemed tangible. His empire covered an area that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, from the North Sea to Italy. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the old order of the Roman Empire had returned, now under Christian auspices and Germanic rule. But the splendor of this moment did not last long. After Charles' death in 814, the centrifugal forces began to take effect. The question of succession put the empire to the test. According to Germanic custom, the inheritance was to be divided among the sons, a principle that contradicted the idea of an undivided empire. Although Charlemagne's son Louis the Pious tried to preserve unity, the conflicts between his sons inevitably led to a rupture. The empire that Charlemagne had created with sword and diplomacy fell apart due to internal tensions. The decision was made in the Treaty of Verdun in 843. Here, the three sons of Louis the Pious, Lothar, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald, agreed on a tripartite division of the empire. Lothar received the Middle Kingdom with Italy and the imperial title, Louis the German received the eastern territories, and Charles the Bald received the western part, which was soon called the West Frankian Empire. This division was not only a pragmatic solution, but the beginning of a new political map of Europe. The West Frankian Empire comprised the old heartlands of Gaul, which had once been the Roman province. Most of its inhabitants spoke Romance dialects, which gradually moved away from Latin and formed the cornerstone of the French language. Although Carolingian rule had prevailed in these areas, the local nobles, bishops, and landlords had enormous power. The king of West Franconia was formally ruler, but his authority was weak and often relied on personal ties. The emergence of the West Frankian Empire thus marked a transition, from the idea of a universalist empire to regional kingdoms that developed increasingly independently. It was an empire that stood between tradition and new beginnings. On the one hand, it carried the heritage of the Carolingians, administration, church, legal system. On the other hand, a new independent area of dominion slowly emerged here, from which France would later emerge. But the road to get there was long and conflictual. From the very beginning, the West Frankian Empire was a realm of tensions between king and nobility, between central power and local autonomy, between Christian unity and secular fragmentation. In addition, there were external threats from Normans, Saracens, and Magyars, who challenged the empire and put their structures to the test. The history of the West Frankian Empire is therefore a history of the struggle for stability, authority, and identity. It shows how a new order emerged from the remnants of a disintegrating empire. It is at the same time the prehistory of France and a decisive chapter in the development of medieval Europe. Chapter 2. The Fall of the Carolingian Empire and the Partition of Verdun, 843. The splendor of the Carolingian Empire, which had found its highest expression with Charlemagne, was no longer permanent after his death in 814. His son, Louis the Pious, inherited an empire of enormous proportions, but at the same time an almost impossible task to ensure the unity of this empire. Unlike his father, who had bound the great men of the empire to himself through personal authority and military successes, Louis lacked the same assertiveness. In addition, he was characterized by a deep ideal of piety, which led him to often put church concerns above political stability. A central problem was the question of succession. According to Franconian law and custom, the inheritance was to be divided among all sons. But an empire like that of the Carolingians, which saw itself as a Christian empire, could not really tolerate dismemberment. Charlemagne had already tried to preserve unity through a system of co-kings, but the tensions between brothers were always a danger. Louis the Pious now saw himself in the same situation, and he tightened it by changing the inheritance regulations several times. First, he appointed his three eldest sons, Lothar, Pippin, and Ludwig, as co-regents over various sub-areas. But then his second wife Judith brought her son Charles, the later Charles the Bald, into play. She also wanted to secure a share of the inheritance for him. This decision met with fierce resistance from the older brothers. The result was decades of civil wars, in which brothers rose up against brothers, supported by rival aristocratic groups and church dignitaries. The emperor's power visibly dwindled in these conflicts. Nobles used the turmoil to expand their own position. They demanded rights, castles, lands, and privileges that weakened the central power. At the same time, external enemies such as the Normans and Saracens attacked, further revealing the inner turmoil. When Louis the Pious died in 840, open fighting broke out between his sons. Lothar, as the eldest son, claimed the entire inheritance and the imperial title, while Louis the German and Charles the Bald defended their shares. The Battle of Fontenoy in 841 was one of the bloodiest civil wars of the time. Although the fronts were unclear and brothers fought against brothers, the conflict ended with the victory of Louis the German and Charles the Bald over Lothar. 2 years later, the brothers agreed on a division of the empire in the Treaty of Verdun, 843, a compromise that recognized the reality of the balance of power. Lothar received the title of emperor for the Middle Kingdom, which stretched from Italy through today's Lorraine to the Netherlands. Louis the German received the Eastern territories, which were to form the core of the later East Franconian Empire and thus the Holy Roman Empire. Charles the Bald finally received the Western lands, which later became the West Franconian Empire, which formed the basis for the emerging France. The Treaty of Verdun was a key moment in European history. It not only sealed the end of the dream of a unified Carolingian empire, but also marked the beginning of national developments. France was to emerge from West Franconia, and Germany from East Franconia. The Middle Kingdom, on the other hand, proved to be unstable, and was later divided between the two neighbors, an area of conflict that was to shape the history of Europe into the 20th century. For the West Franconian Empire, Verdun meant a new beginning under Charles the Bald. But this new beginning was burdened from the beginning, by the weakness of the central power, by powerful noble families, and by the threat from outside. The following decades were to show that the empire of Charles the Bald was a legitimate successor to the Carolingian legacy, but at the same time had yet to find its own identity. Chapter 3. The Carolingian Kings in the West Franconian Empire. With the Treaty of Verdun in 843, Charles the Bald had received the West Franconian Empire. But the rule over this new part of the empire was anything but secure. The Carolingian kings in the West had to deal with numerous problems: a weak central power, self-confident greats, a restless church, and constant threats from outside, especially from the Normans. Their regencies were characterized by a constant struggle for authority, a struggle that they fought only with varying success. Charles the Bald himself stood at the cradle of this empire. He was a clever but also often hapless ruler, whose name already refers to his susceptibility to ridicule. But despite all the difficulties, he laid the foundations for the West Franconian Empire. Charles had to assert himself several times against rebellious nobles and his own brothers before he could consolidate his position. He sought support from the church, which he endowed with privileges, and tried to strengthen his power through marriage alliances and the expansion of court culture. Under Charles' reign, the drama of Norman invasions began, which afflicted the west coasts and penetrated deep into the interior. Paris, Rouen, and Bordeaux were repeatedly the target of raids. Charles reacted partly with fighting, partly with tribute payments. a policy that brought relief in the short term but weakened his authority in the long term. Nevertheless, he managed to keep the empire together in difficult times, and he even secured his claim to the Carolingian inheritance once again with the coronation of the emperor in 875. After Charles' death in 877, his son Ludwig the Stammler succeeded him. His epithet already refers to the weakness of his personality. He ruled for only 2 years and could not take action against either the Normans or the all-powerful Greats. His early death marked the beginning of a period of instability that was to permanently weaken the monarchy in the West Frankish Empire. His successors, the sons Ludwig III and Carloman II, shared the rule, but both died young and childless. This created a vacuum that the great men of the empire used to expand their power. The throne finally went to Charles the Simple, a grandson of Charles the Bald, whose surname already reveals that he was considered less assertive in tradition. Charles the Simple, however, was a key figure. Under his rule, the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte was signed in 911, in which he ceded land on the Seine to the Viking leader Rollo, which later became the Duchy of Normandy. On the one hand, this agreement was a concession to the weakness of the monarchy, but on the other hand, it was also a politically clever move, as the Normans integrated themselves into Frankish society and soon rose to become one of the most powerful principalities in the empire. The later phase of the Carolingian kings in the West Franconian Empire was marked by a further loss of power. The crown became more and more dependent on the big ones, who exercised de facto control over their regions. Counts, dukes, and marquises ruled like little kings, while the actual king was little more than a symbol. This development marked the transition from the Carolingian idea of the empire to a more feudal order. Despite all their weaknesses, the Carolingian kings played an important role in the West Franconian Empire. They kept alive the claim to unified rule, and thus created the institutional framework in which the Capetians were later able to establish themselves. Without the memory of the Carolingian kingship, the crown might have completely lost its legitimacy in the 10th century. The history of the Carolingian kings in West Franconia is therefore a history of decline, but at the same time also of continuity. Their failure prepared the ground for the new order that began with the Robertines and finally the Capetians. Chapter 4. The Power of the Great and the Collapse of Kingship. Already in the first decades after the Treaty of Verdun, it became clear that the authority of the West Frankish kings was not sufficient to hold the empire together in the long term. While the Carolingians formally ruled over the entire area, in practice it was the great noble families who took more and more power into their hands. The process that began here led in the long term to the disintegration of the royal central power and the formation of a strongly feudal order. The root of this loss of power lay in the structure of the empire itself. Even under Charlemagne, the rule had been decentralized. Counts and margraves administered the regions, ensured law and order, and waged war in the name of the king. But while Charles had still been able to control these officials through personal authority, his West Franconian successors lacked this strength. The counts began to regard their offices as hereditary and to pass them on to their sons as their own property. As a result, royal orders increasingly became private property. At the same time, the nobles used the threat of external enemies to consolidate their position. The Norman attacks forced them to build castles and set up local militias. Castles became symbols of the new balance of power. They were bases from which a count or duke exercised his rule, regardless of the king's authority. The population sought shelter near these castles, which strengthened the bond with the local lords. The church also played a double role in this process. On the one hand, it supported the monarchy and gave it sacral legitimacy. On the other hand, bishops and abbeys were themselves large landowners and rulers who often pursued their interests independently. Some bishops acted almost like secular princes, with castles, retinues, and military power. The result was an ever-increasing decline in royal control. The king could only really rule where he was personally present or where he appointed loyal followers. In many regions, however, he was dependent on the big ones, who formally paid homage to him but in practice acted autonomously. The king became a figure who had more symbolic than real power. This change was particularly visible in coronation practice. While in the early Carolingian period, the elevation by the church and the consent of the great was an act of legitimacy, in the 10th century, this consent became a condition. Without the consent of the most important dukes and counts, no king could ascend to the throne. Thus, royalty was transformed from a strong institution into an office controlled and limited by the greats. However, the collapse of the king's rule was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual process. As late as the 9th century, the Carolingians were still trying to assert their authority. Charles the Bald through imperial ambitions, Charles the Simple through clever alliances. But the more the big ones consolidated their power, the clearer it became that the empire was disintegrating into small dominions. This process was also the birth of feudalism in West Franconia. Vassality, feudal systems, and personal ties between lords and followers took the place of centralized rule. The king's power remained, but it was embedded in a network of dependencies that often made him one actor among many. Thus, in the 9th and 10th centuries, the West Franconian Empire was transformed from a Carolingian kingdom into a country in which the greats dominated. But this disintegration of the central power did not mean the end, but rather the transformation of the empire. For the social order of the High Middle Ages developed out of these structures, and in the end there was a new monarchy which was reformed in France with the Capetians. Chapter 5. Society and Economy in Early West Franconia. The West Franconian Empire of the 9th and 10th centuries was not only a scene of political power struggles and military threats, but also a living space for millions of people whose everyday lives took place in the structures of villages, landlords, and churches. To understand the history of this empire, one must also take a look at its social and economic foundations. They formed the foundation on which the power of the great rested as well as the weakness of the king. The society of the West Franconian Empire was clearly structured, even if the boundaries between the classes were sometimes fluid. At the top was the king, but his authority was limited by the greats. These great ones were made up of dukes, margraves, counts, and powerful bishops. They controlled large areas, had their own castles and followers, and formed the real elite of the empire. Their power was based on land ownership and the right to demand taxes and services from the population. Below this elite were the vassals, who owed their position to feudal ties. They received land or income from the lord and in return pledged themselves to military service and loyalty. This network of personal ties, the feudal system, was in the process of being developed and developed particularly strongly in the West Franconian Empire. It offered security at a time when central rule was weak and external threats were omnipresent. The vast majority of the population consisted of farmers. They lived in small villages and worked on the lands of the landlords. Some of them were unfree serfs who were tied to the soil and had to pay taxes in kind or labor services. Others were free farmers, but they too often sought the protection of a lord and gave up part of their freedom to do so. This dependence was less an expression of brutal oppression than a system of protection in an uncertain world. Economic life was predominantly agricultural. Agriculture and animal husbandry formed the basis, with grain, especially wheat and rye, being the most important food. Technical innovations such as the heavy plow and three-field farming began to prevail, which slowly improved yields. Nevertheless, agriculture was susceptible to crop failures, droughts, or raids that could plunge entire regions into misery. In addition to agriculture, local trade played a role. Markets took place in cities and larger settlements where craftsmen offered their goods and traders brought goods from more distant regions. But compared to Roman antiquity, long-distance trade had declined sharply. Insecurity on the roads, the threat of Normans, and the low purchasing power of the rural population restricted trade. Only a few cities such as Paris, Orléans, or Bordeaux retained super-regional importance. The church was a central part of society. It owned large estates, often farmed by dependent farmers, and at the same time formed one of the largest landlords in the empire. Monasteries were not only religious but also economic and cultural centers. They organized agriculture, preserved documents, and disseminated education. For the people, the church was also a spiritual support that conveyed protection and meaning. The social fabric of the West Franconian Empire was thus characterized by dependencies and ties. Freedom was a relative concept. Even free peasants or lower nobles were bound up in a web of mutual duties that promised security and stability. This order reflected the political reality, the lack of a strong central power compensated for by local ties and personal loyalties. Thus, society and economy in the early West Franconian Empire formed a world that was strongly rural, hierarchical, and characterized by mutual obligations. These structures were not only the result of the decline of the Carolingian Empire, but also the basis for what would later shape medieval France, a society in which the king did not rule absolutely, but remained dependent on the power of the greats and the loyalty of his subjects. Chapter 6. The Church as a Support and Counterweight. In the West Franconian Empire of the 9th and 10th centuries, the Church played a prominent role that went far beyond the religious. It was not only the guardian of the faith, but also a political actor, an economic landowner, and a cultural center. For the weak West Frankish kings, the church was often the most important support, but at the same time, it was also a counterweight that pursued its own interests and asserted its own claims to power. The close connection between royalty and church had already been established in the Carolingian period. Charlemagne had understood his kingdom as the kingdom of God, in which secular and spiritual order should belong together. This tradition led to the West Frankish kings also securing their rule through sacral legitimation. Coronations were performed by bishops, anointments gave the king an almost priestly ordination, and church rites strengthened the prestige of the monarchy. Without the consent of the church, hardly any king could rule permanently. But this proximity also made the king dependent. Bishops and abbots were often powerful lords themselves who had large estates at their disposal and maintained their own retinue. Some monasteries, such as Cluny, developed into independent centers that were hardly under the control of the king. The church was thus at the same time a pillar of the crown and an independent power that pursued its own interests. This dual role became particularly clear in the practice of the landlord. Many monasteries and dioceses owned extensive estates that were managed by dependent farmers. This made the church one of the largest economic factors of the empire. It collected taxes, organized the cultivation, and ensured that the monasteries became centers of innovation and administration. At a time when cities were weak and trade routes unsafe, church institutions were often stable economic areas. Culturally, too, the church was the heart of the West Franconian Empire. Monasteries preserved books, copied manuscripts, and imparted education. In a world in which writing was almost exclusively at home in the spiritual realm, monks and clerics were the keepers and transmitters of knowledge. They issued certificates, kept chronicles, and ensured that the memory of the past remained alive. Without them, the history of the West Franconian Empire would hardly be reconstructed today. But the church was not only a preserver, but also a reformer. Movements such as the Cluny Reform in the 10th century sought to free church life from secular influences and strengthen spiritual discipline. These reforms also had political consequences. By emphasizing their independence from local nobles and subordinating themselves directly to the Pope, monasteries such as Cluny evaded the control of kings and princes. Although the reform weakened secular rule in the short term, it strengthened the idea of a superordinate ecclesiastical order that encompassed the whole of Europe in the long term. For people in everyday life, the church was an omnipresent companion. It structured life through festivals and fasting. It was the place of baptism, marriage, and burial. In a time of uncertainty, it offered support, comfort, and hope. At the same time, however, it was also an authority that set morals and order, punished sins, and shaped people's thinking through preaching and pastoral care. In the political structure of the West Franconian Empire, the church thus formed a decisive element. It gave legitimacy to the kings, but at the same time represented a power that controlled these kings. She was a keeper of knowledge and order, but also an independent factor who often went her own way. This is how the role of the church in the West Franconian Empire can be summarized. It was at the same time support and counterweight, partner and competitor of the monarchy. Without them, the empire would not be stabilized or understood in its development. But their independence also contributed to the fact that the kingdom did not gain the strength it would gain in later centuries. Chapter 7. The Threat of Vikings and Normans. Hardly any external danger shaped the West Franconian Empire in the 9th and 10th centuries as strongly as the attacks of the Vikings, who were usually referred to as Normans in the Frankish sources. These warriors and seafarers from Scandinavia used their fast ships to sail up rivers and venture deep inland. Their raids shook the empire, revealed the weakness of the kings, and contributed decisively to the shift in the balance of power in favor of the local lords. The first major attacks began as early as the 840s, shortly after the division of Verdun. The Normans took advantage of the inner turmoil of the Frankish Empire and the lack of central defense to plunder coastal cities and monasteries. Monasteries such as Saint Denis, Tours, or Saint Germain-des-Prés, which were not only religious but also economic centers, were plundered and burned. The treasures that had been collected there attracted the attackers as well as the supplies of food and livestock. The Seine basin was particularly badly affected. Paris, which was still a comparatively small city at the time, was besieged several times by Normans. In 845, the Vikings under their leader Ragnar Lodbrok sailed up the Seine and extorted an enormous ransom from King Charles the Bald to withdraw again. This event came as a shock to the empire. It showed that even the Carolingian heartland was not safe. The reaction of the West Franconian kings was contradictory. On the one hand, they tried to use armies against the attackers. But mobilization was slow, and the Normans usually withdrew before the Frankish troops arrived. On the other hand, the kings resorted to tribute payments, the so-called Danegeld. In the short term, they were able to buy calm, but in the long term, it weakened their authority, as it was seen as a sign of weakness. The Norman attacks increased the importance of the local nobles. Because the king was often unable to help in time, it was the counts, dukes, and bishops who provided defense in their regions. They built castles, organized militias, and confronted the attackers. As a result, their reputation among the population grew, while royal power continued to erode. Over time, the Normans changed their strategy. Robberies increasingly turned into permanent settlements. The fertile river landscapes and the political weaknesses of the empire made the country attractive for settlement. This was most evident in 911, when King Charles the Simple signed the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte with the Viking leader Rollo. Rollo received the area around the Lower Seine, the later Duchy of Normandy. As a fief, in return, he promised protection from further attacks and the acceptance of Christianity. This treaty was a turning point. On the one hand, it was an admission of royal weakness, as the king had to reconcile foreign conquerors with land. On the other hand, it was a pragmatic move that integrated the Normans into Frankish society. Normandy quickly developed into one of the strongest regions of the empire, and Rollo's descendants would later even determine the fate of England. The threat from the Vikings was thus not only a military problem, but an engine of social and political change. It contributed to the flourishing of the castle system, to the strengthening of the feudal system, and to the further decline of the king's authority. At the same time, it led to the emergence of new powers, such as Normandy, which were to shape European history for centuries to come. Thus, the Norman threat was a double-edged sword. It brought suffering and destruction, but it also drove developments that shaped the medieval West Frankonian Empire and gave it a new dynamic. Chapter 8. Charles the Bald and his successors. Charles the Bald was the first ruler to rule the West Frankish Empire after the Treaty of Verdun in 843. His epithet may allude to his outward appearance, but the sources also hint at mockery of a ruler with limited assertiveness. Nevertheless, Charles was a central figure who laid the foundations for the West Frankish monarchy in difficult times, even if his successors found it difficult to maintain this legacy. Charles had to secure his rule from the beginning against strong resistance. The nobles no longer regarded royalty as an undisputed authority, but as an authority with which they could negotiate their own interests. Charles reacted to this with a policy of concessions. He granted offices and lands, he sought an alliance with the church, and rewarded loyalty with privileges. This strategy stabilized his rule in the short term, but led to the erosion of royal power in the long term, as the counts and bishops increasingly regarded their fiefs as hereditary. Another problem was the Norman attacks that struck the empire in the 840s. Charles had to experience that Paris was besieged by the Vikings and only spared by high tribute payments. Although he tried to organize defensive measures, his resources were limited and his dependence on the local lords grew. Despite these weaknesses, Charles succeeded in having himself crowned emperor by the Pope in Rome in 875, a last attempt to build on the Carolingian heritage of the entire empire. But his imperial dignity remained largely symbolic and had little practical effect on his position of power in the West. When he died in 877, the West Frankonian Empire was marked by internal tensions and external threats. His son Ludwig the Stammler took over the reign, but his reign was short and not very successful. His epithet indicates a speech impediment, which contemporaries interpreted as a weakness. After only 2 years, he died in 879, and his 2 sons Ludwig III and Carloman II followed him. Although these young rulers were able to hold their own against the Normans militarily, for example in the Battle of Saucourt in 881, both died early and without male descendants. This led to a phase of uncertainty. Various pretenders to the throne laid claim to the crown, and royalty became more and more the plaything of the greats. Finally, Charles the Simple, a grandson of Charles the Bald, ascended the throne. His epithet refers to his alleged inexperience or naivety. Charles faced massive challenges: Norman attacks, the rise of powerful noble families, and the increasing independence of the regions. Charles the Simple became famous with the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte 911, in which he ceded land on the Seine to the Viking leader Rollo, the nucleus of Normandy. This step was both an admission of royal weakness and a pragmatic solution that pacified the north. But Karl's position remained uncertain. He soon lost the support of many greats and was overthrown in 922 by Robert I, the ancestor of the Robertines. Charlemagne's successors, including his son Louis IV, known as from overseas, were unable to decisively strengthen the monarchy. Louis IV had lived in exile in England before returning to West Franconia, but he too was dependent on the greats. Again and again, dukes and counts determined the rise and fall of the kings. The reign of the Carolingian successors of Charles the Bald shows the progressive decline of the central power. Every king was dependent on the goodwill of the greats, and every attempt to strengthen royal authority failed due to the reality of the regional balance of power. The monarchy survived, but it had weakened and increasingly become an institution with no real control over the empire. Chapter 9. The Role of the Marquises and Dukes. While the royal power in the West Franconian Empire dwindled more and more, other actors took its place: the dukes, counts, and especially the margraves. They were the ones who exercised real authority in the regions, while the king often remained only a symbolic figure. Their importance was based not only on military strength and land ownership, but also on the ability to provide protection and maintain order in an uncertain time. The margraves, originally referred to as marchiones, were mainly deployed in the border regions of the empire. There, on behalf of the king, they were to provide security, ward off threats, and show a military presence. Since these regions were often particularly endangered, margraves were given greater powers than ordinary counts. In practice, this meant that they acted almost independently, raised their own armies, and ruled over their territories like petty kings. The power of the margraves was a double-edged sword. They stabilized the borders, but at the same time undermined the royal central power. The dukes had a similar position, even if some of their roots went back further. They were at the head of large tribal or landscape associations, for example in Aquitaine, Burgundy, or Brittany. These regions had already possessed a certain independence in late antiquity and under the Merovingians, which now broke ground again. Dukes acted as defenders of their regions, especially in times of Norman invasions or internal turmoil. Their power was based on the trust of the local greats, who accepted them as leaders, and less on the appointment by the king. An example of this development is the Duchy of Aquitaine, which repeatedly vacillated between independence and subordination to the king. The dukes of Aquitaine saw themselves as rulers of their own empire, even if they formally remained vassals of the West Frankish king. The situation was similar in Burgundy, where local dynasties became powerful and ruled their territories almost independently. The role of the dukes and margraves was not only militarily decisive, but also socially and economically. They controlled the construction of castles, organized markets, promoted monasteries, and shaped the development of their regions. For the people, they were often the real masters, while the king resided far away and had little influence on daily life. But this decentralization also gave rise to new structures. The feudal system developed from the retinues of the dukes and margraves, personal ties between lords and vassals based on loyalty, protection, and the allocation of land. This created a network of obligations that determined political and social life in West Franconia. Although royal authority was further weakened by this system, at the same time society was stabilized, as everyone was integrated into a network of dependencies and loyalties. The power of the dukes and margraves paved the way for the dynasties that claimed the throne in the 10th century. The Robertines in particular, who exercised great influence as dukes of France, were eventually to usurp the kingdom with Hugh Capet. The development was thus predetermined. An empire that was formally ruled by the king became a patchwork of regional rulers whose leaders ultimately conquered the crown themselves. The role of the margraves and dukes was therefore ambivalent. On the one hand, they were pillars of the empire, offering protection and maintaining order. On the other hand, they were the gravediggers of the Carolingian central power. They embodied the transition from an empire under a king to a feudal society in which power was distributed in a decentralized manner, and the foundations for medieval France were laid. Chapter 10: The Rise of the Robertines. Among the great noble families that gained importance in the West Franconian Empire, the Robertines stand out in particular. Not only did they provide powerful dukes, but they also laid the foundation for a new dynasty that eventually took over the kingdom from the Carolingians. The Capetians emerged from the Robertines, the dynasty that was to shape France for centuries. The rise of the Robertines is thus a key moment in the history of the West Franconian Empire. The family had its roots in the Franconian nobility and was initially anchored in the area between the Seine and the Loire. Their power was based on extensive landholdings, strategically important castles, and control over central regions of the empire. Their position was particularly important in the Duchy of Frankish, which encompassed the area around Paris. Here, in the heart of the West Franconian Empire, the Robertines were able to develop their authority and establish themselves as an indispensable pillar of the empire. An important representative was Robert the Brave, died 866, who was appointed Margrave of Neustria to defend the empire against the Normans. His nickname indicates that he excelled in the battles against the Vikings and gained great fame as a result. Even though he died in battle, he established the military prestige of his family, which continued to have an effect for generations. In the 9th and 10th centuries, the Robertines succeeded in steadily expanding their power base. They benefited from the weakness of the Carolingian kings, who were increasingly dependent on the support of the greats. In this situation, the Robertines were able to consolidate their position as Dukes of France and further expand their role as protectors against the Normans. A decisive turning point came in 922, when Charles the Simple was overthrown. He was replaced by Robert I, a brother of Odo of Paris, who had already been elected king in 888 after the Normans had besieged Paris. This election clearly showed that the kingship was no longer awarded solely according to dynastic law, but that the approval and trust of the great ones were also decisive. Robert I reigned only briefly, but his coronation was a signal. The Carolingians were no longer untouchable, and the Robertines appeared as serious competitors. Even though the crown went back to a Carolingian after Robert's death, the course was clear. Especially under Hugh the Great, the son of Robert I, the family reached a peak of its power. Hugh controlled large parts of the empire, ruled the heartland around Paris and Orléans, and was de facto more powerful than the king himself. Although he refrained from claiming the crown directly, his position as Dux Francorum, Duke of the Franks, made him the most important power factor in the empire. His son Hugh Capet was finally to take the step that finally transferred the kingdom into the hands of the Robertines. When he was elected king by the great men of the empire in 987, the Carolingian dynasty in West Franconia ended and the Capetians took over their inheritance. The rise of the Robertines was thus not a sudden upheaval, but the result of a long process. They took advantage of the weakness of the Carolingians, expanded their military and economic power, presented themselves as defenders against the Normans, and thus earned the trust of the greats. Step by step, they transformed themselves from dukes into kings and created a dynasty that was to shape France for centuries.
Chapter 11. Hugh Capet, from Duke to King. Hugh Capet marks the beginning of a new chapter in the history of the West Franconian Empire, marking the transition to medieval France. His election as king in 987 is considered the end of Carolingian rule in the West and the beginning of the Capetian dynasty that was to shape France for centuries. But this transition was not the work of a single moment, but the result of a long process in which Hugh Capet became a key figure. Hugh came from the Robertine dynasty, which had already played a dominant role in the 9th and 10th centuries. His father, Hugh the Great, had been the most powerful prince in the empire and had ruled over large parts of the country as Dux Francorum. Hugh Capet inherited not only lands from him, but also enormous political prestige. The epithet Capet probably derives from the long cloak, capa, he wore as a badge of power, or possibly from his close connection to the Abbey of St. Denis, where he acted as lay abbot. The political situation at the end of the 10th century favored his rise. The last Carolingian kings, Louis IV from overseas, Lothar, and Louis V, formally held the throne, but their power hardly extended beyond the immediate surrounding area. They were dependent on the great dukes and counts who ruled de facto independently. When Louis V died in 987 without descendants, the Carolingian line in the West Franconian Empire had become extinct. Now the question of succession arose. Actually, Charles of Lower Lorraine, a relative from the Carolingian line, would have had a claim to the throne, but he was politically isolated and viewed with suspicion by the great men of the empire, as he maintained close ties to the East Frankish royal family. Instead, the most influential nobles chose Hugh Capet. His election was based on a consensus. He was powerful enough to represent royalty, but not powerful enough to dominate the great. On 3rd July 987, Hugo Capet was elevated to king in Noyen. The coronation was carried out by the Archbishop of Reims, which underlined the close connection between royalty and church. But his election was not without controversy. Charles of Lower Lorraine laid claim and also found supporters. However, Hugh was able to hold his own because he skillfully forged alliances and consolidated his position in the heartland around Paris and Orleans. As king, Hugo Capet had only limited means of power. His dominion, the so-called Ile-de-France, was small, and he was dependent on the goodwill of the dukes and counts. But his greatest success was to anchor royalty in his family. Already during his lifetime, he had his son Robert crowned co-king in order to secure the hereditary nature of the crown. In doing so, he created a tradition that gave the Capetians long-term stability. The election of Hugo Capet thus marks a turning point. With him, the era of the Carolingians in the West Frankonian Empire ended, and a new dynasty began. But this change was not a sudden increase in power. Rather, the monarchy remained weak and dependent on the great. It was not until the following centuries that the Capetians succeeded in expanding their power and developing the monarchy into a central institution of France. Hugo Capet himself was less a brilliant ruler than a skillful realpolitiker. His merit was to keep the fragile institution of royalty alive and to secure it for his family. In doing so, he laid the foundation for one of the longest-lived dynasties in Europe, and finally transformed the West Frankonian Empire into what we later know as France. Chapter 12. The Transition from the West Frankish Empire to the French Kingdom. The election of Hugo Capet in 987 marked not only the end of Carolingian rule in the West, but also the beginning of a new era. But the transformation of the West Frankonian Empire into the French Kingdom was a slow, multi-layered process that dragged on for centuries. It was not a sudden break, but a gradual change of structures, concepts, and identities. Initially, the title of king remained unchanged. Hugo Capet and his early successors still saw themselves as kings of the Franks, Rex Francorum, not as kings of France. This title reflected the Carolingian heritage and emphasized the rule over a people, not a territory. It was not until the 12th century that the term King of France gradually became established, expressing the awareness of an independent empire. The borders of the West Frankonian Empire also initially hardly differed from those of France in the early Middle Ages. But the reality was different. While the Capetians only directly ruled the small heartland around Paris and Orleans, the large regions, Burgundy, Aquitaine, Normandy, Brittany, were largely independent. The kings had to fight for their influence step by step, and it was only after centuries that they succeeded in transforming the fragmented parts into a closed kingdom. An important factor in this process was the church. It supported the new dynasty because it saw in the Capetians a stable partner who was not involved in dynastic disputes like the Carolingians. The close link between the kings and the Archbishop of Reims, who traditionally performed the anointing, gave the Capetians a sacral legitimacy that strengthened their rule. The feudal system also played a central role. The early Capetians were weak, but they knew how to use the vassal system. By emphasizing their authority as supreme feudal lords, they were able to consolidate the bond of the great ones to the crown in the long term. Although the dukes and counts were more powerful than the king in the 10th and 11th centuries, the legal supremacy of the kingship remained, a decisive cornerstone for the later increase in power. At the same time, a cultural change took place. The population of the West Frankonian Empire no longer spoke the Latin of the Romans, but Romance dialects, which developed into Old French. The self-perception also changed. The Franks, an originally Germanic people, gradually became a broader community that saw itself as French.
This change of identity was slow, but it showed that the West Franconian Empire did not simply remain a successor to the Carolingian Empire, but took on a new independent form. The transition from the West Franconian Empire to the French kingdom was therefore a process in three dimensions: linguistic-cultural, institutional, and political. Linguistically, Latin changed to French. Institutionally, royalty changed from a weak symbol to an increasingly central power. Politically, the empire changed from a loose collection of rulers to a closed kingdom. In 987, no one would have spoken of a Kingdom of France. But in retrospect, it becomes clear that Hugo Capet had embarked on a path that gradually transformed the West Franconian Empire into France, which was to become one of the leading powers in Europe in the High and Late Middle Ages.
Chapter 13. The relationship to East Franconia and the emerging Holy Roman Empire. From the very beginning, the fate of the West Franconian Empire was closely linked to that of its eastern neighbors. Since the division of the Carolingian Empire by the Treaty of Verdun in 843, West and East Franconia had been in a relationship that was characterized by rivalry, competition, and occasionally cooperation. While the East Franconian Empire developed from the empire of Louis the German in the east, the germ of the later Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, the foundation for the Kingdom of France was formed in the west. The two empires shared not only a common past, but also a long border that repeatedly gave rise to tensions. In particular, the Middle Kingdom, which had emerged under Lothar I and later disintegrated into Lotharingia, became a permanent point of contention. This region, which roughly corresponded to today's Lorraine, Belgium, the Netherlands, and parts of Switzerland, was located between West and East Franconia and was claimed by both sides. Again and again, parts of Lotharingia changed rulers, depending on which side was stronger at the time. The Carolingians in the West and East tried to secure their claims to each other through marriages and alliances. But in practice, mistrust and rivalry often dominate. West Frankish kings such as Charles the Bald or Charles the Simple had to deal with East Frankish kings, who for their part did not want to give up their claim to the entire Carolingian inheritance. The question of the imperial title was particularly sensitive. While Charles the Bald was crowned emperor in Rome in 875, the East Frankish rulers also claimed this dignity. With the coronation of Otto I as emperor in 962, which founded the Holy Roman Empire, the focus finally shifted to the east. From then on, the empire was firmly linked to the East Frankish kings, while the West Franconian Empire lost the title and concentrated more on the role of the Rex Francorum. The relationship between the two empires was marked not only by conflicts, but also by mutual dependencies. In times of inner weakness, nobles or pretenders to the throne sought support from their respective neighbors. Charles of Lower Lorraine, the last Carolingian candidate in the West, found support in the East Franconian Empire, but this made him suspicious for many West Franconian nobles and weakened his claim. The rivalry with the East Franconian Empire also shaped the identity of the West. The more clearly an empire developed in the East, the stronger the awareness of being an independent kingdom developed in the West. This process contributed to the West Frankish Empire gradually becoming France, no longer a part of a larger Carolingian whole, but an empire with its own legitimacy. The border between West and East Franconia, which was created in the 9th century, was to remain a source of conflict for centuries. Lotharingia, Alsace, Burgundy, all these regions were repeatedly contested between the two powers. The dispute over these border areas was not only a question of politics, but also a central element of European history up to modern times. Thus, the relationship to East Franconia and the emerging Holy Roman Empire shows two things. On the one hand, both empires were connected by their common Carolingian origins, and on the other hand, it was precisely this origin that led to lasting rivalry. The competition between East and West laid the foundation for the centuries-long competition between France and Germany. a tension that was to shape the history of Europe in changing forms until the 20th century. Chapter 14. West Franconia and Burgundy. In the early Middle Ages, Burgundy was one of the most important and, at the same time, most controversial regions in Europe. Its location between West and East Franconia, between the Alps and the Rhone, made it a key strategic area that was of outstanding importance both politically and economically. For the West Franconian Empire, Burgundy was therefore always a double-edged issue, an area that they wanted to control but which was always characterized by independence and changing loyalties. Burgundy's roots go far back into the migration period. As early as the 5th century, a kingdom of the Burgundians had formed there, which was later conquered by the Franks. Under the Merovingians and Carolingians, the region remained an independent cultural landscape with a mixture of Roman traditions, Germanic structures, and Christian influences. Its location on important trade routes, especially along the Rhone, made it a prosperous area. With the division of Verdun in 843, Burgundy was divided. Parts fell to the Middle Kingdom of Lothar, others to the West Frankish Empire. This fragmentation meant that Burgundy was never fully integrated into the rule of a single king, but asserted itself as a power factor in its own right. In the course of the 9th and 10th centuries, various Burgundian dominions emerged. The Duchy of Burgundy, which was more oriented towards West Franconia, and the Kingdom of Upper Burgundy, which was closely linked to the Alpine regions. For the West Frankish kings, the Duchy of Burgundy was particularly important. It was located in the core of the Frankish region and formed an important counterweight to the Dukes of Aquitaine and the Normans in the north. But the Burgundian dukes were independent and only loosely connected to the king. They had a strong regional base and were often more powerful than the king himself. Relations between West Franconia and Burgundy therefore fluctuated between cooperation and rivalry. Again and again, the West Frankish kings tried to strengthen their influence through marriages or military interventions. But most of the time, the dukes succeeded in asserting their independence. Especially in the 10th century, when the kingdom was weak, the Burgundian princes appeared self-confident and determined politics in their region independently. At the same time, Burgundy played an important cultural role. Monasteries such as Cluny, which was founded in 910, developed into spiritual centers of European standing. The Cluniac reform, which emanated from here, shaped not only the West Frankish Empire but the entire church. It was an expression of a spiritual renewal that radiated from Burgundy and at the same time underlined the political importance of the region. In the long term, Burgundy was to be torn between France and the empire again and again. Even in the early days of the West Frankish Empire, it became clear that Burgundy was not simply a part of the kingdom, but an independent power with its own interests. This special position was to continue into the late Middle Ages, when the Burgundian dukes rose to become one of the most powerful princely houses in Europe, and at times represented serious competition for the French monarchy. In the early West Frankish Empire, however, Burgundy was above all a symbol of the limits of royal power, a space that was nominally under the rule of the king, but in reality was characterized by local dynasties. Burgundy was thus a reflection of the entire empire, fragmented, regionally oriented, and only weakly bound by the central power. Chapter 15. Culture and Education in the West Franconian Empire. Despite the political fragmentation and the threats from external enemies, the West Franconian Empire was by no means a cultural desert. On the contrary, it was a time of change, in which old traditions lived on and new developments took shape. Culture and education were strongly influenced by the church, which acted as the guardian of knowledge and at the same time gave new impulses. The Carolingian Renaissance of the 8th and early 9th centuries had also left its mark on the West Franconian Empire. Under Charlemagne, a targeted promotion of education and scholarship had been pursued. Monasteries and cathedral schools had been founded, manuscripts had been collected and copied, and a uniform script, the Carolingian minuscule, had been introduced.
These achievements were not lost in the West Franconian Empire, even if political instability hampered their further development. The church was the center of culture and education. In monasteries such as Saint Denis, Saint Germain-des-Prés, or Tours, manuscripts were preserved and reproduced. The monks were the real bearers of the written culture. They copied biblical texts, church fathers, but also ancient authors such as Virgil, Ovid, or Cicero. Without this work, a large part of the ancient heritage would have been lost. The monastery of Cluny, founded in 910, became particularly important. Although its greatest cultural flowering was only in later times, a new spiritual orientation was already reflected in its foundation. Cluny was not only a religious center, but also a place where liturgy, music, and art were cultivated. The Cluniac movement was to shape the whole of Europe from Burgundy and give new impetus to monasticism. The cathedral schools also played an important role. They offered training for the clergy and were thus the nucleus of an educational system that went beyond the purely religious. Reading, writing, Latin, but also logic and rhetoric were among the basics. At a time when secular rulers were increasingly dependent on educated advisors, the importance of these schools increased. Language was another field of change. While the written language remained Latin, people spoke Romance dialects in everyday life, which increasingly distanced themselves from classical Latin. This vernacular gradually developed into Old French. A famous testimony to this change is the Strasbourg Oaths of 842, which were taken both in Latin and in a Romance vernacular, an early sign that the West Franconian Empire was moving away from antiquity linguistically and developing a new identity. The West Franconian Empire was also not insignificant in art. Church buildings in the Carolingian style shaped the landscape, and magnificent manuscripts with ornate initials and miniatures were created in book illumination. Artistic production was almost exclusively associated with the church, but it had a great influence on the aesthetic development of the Middle Ages. Overall, it can be said that culture and education in Westphalia were characterized less by spectacular innovations than by continuity and gradual development. The church kept the Carolingian heritage alive, ensured the preservation of ancient texts, and prepared the ground for the cultural flowering of the High Middle Ages. This shows that despite its political weakness, the West Franconian Empire retained a cultural foundation that was decisive for the further history of France. While kings fell and dukes ascended, monasteries and schools ensured that knowledge, language, and arts survived, and that a new cultural identity was formed in the midst of the turmoil.
Chapter 16. Architecture and Art in the 9th and 10th centuries. The architecture and art of the West Franconian Empire reflected the political, social, and intellectual upheavals of the time. They were an expression of the Carolingian tradition, but at the same time, they were also harbingers of the developments that were later to lead to Romanesque and Gothic styles. Despite all the instability, the 9th and 10th centuries produced remarkable buildings and works of art that shaped the face of medieval France. The architecture was closely linked to the church. Monasteries, cathedrals, and smaller village churches formed the most important buildings of the era. They served not only as places of prayer, but also as centers of community, as refuge from attacks, and as symbols of divine order. Many of these buildings were based on the Carolingian tradition, which in turn was strongly influenced by the late antique and Byzantine heritage. The monastery complexes were particularly impressive. The monastery of Cluny, founded in 910, quickly became a center of spiritual and architectural renewal. Although the complex did not reach its monumental size until the 11th and 12th centuries, the early buildings followed a clear, well-thought-out plan. Spacious churches with a high choir, wide naves, and rich liturgical furnishings. Cluny was an example of a new form of architecture that emphasized order, size, and harmony.
Other monasteries such as Saint-Benoît-sur-Loire or Saint-Germain-des-Prés in Paris also showed the combination of tradition and innovation. Basilicas with 3 naves, apses in the east, and towers above the westwork characterized the style. Many of these structures were built in stone, a sign of permanence and stability in a time of uncertainty. The castles, which became more numerous in the course of the Norman invasions and the weakening of the central power, initially had a simple character. These were often wood and earth fortifications, so-called mottes, which were built on artificial hills. Only gradually did stone castles develop from them, which were to shape the image of the medieval landscape. Nevertheless, even these early fortifications were an expression of a new form of architecture, not sacred but military and a symbol of the power of local lords. The art of the West Franconian Empire was closely linked to book culture. In the scriptoria of the monasteries, magnificently illuminated manuscripts were created which adorned both Bibles and liturgical texts. Gold grounds, colorful initials, and figurative representations combined to form a style that took up both Carolingian tradition and new influences. The illumination of tours and reims was particularly famous. There are also remarkable works in sculpture and cabaret. Ivory carvings, reliquaries made of gold and silver, ornate crosses, and liturgical utensils testify to the high level of craftsmanship. These objects were not only religious symbols, but also an expression of the power of the church and the piety of the faithful. Painting played a rather modest role, but frescoes in churches and chapels gave insights into the biblical imagery. Figures were often depicted schematically, with clear contours and symbolic expressiveness. The naturalism of ancient art was largely lost, but in its place came a symbolic pictorial language that put the religious message in the foreground. The art and architecture of the 9th and 10th centuries in West Franconia are thus a link. They preserved the heritage of the Carolingians and paved the way for the great architecture of the Romanesque period. Churches, monasteries, and castles were not only buildings of stone, but manifestations of a society that vacillated between tradition and new beginnings. They embodied the faith, power, and hope of that era, and made visible what lived in the hearts and minds of the people. Chapter 17: The Development of Cities and Trade. Although the West Franconian Empire remained strongly agrarian in the centuries after the division of the Carolingian Empire, the cities and trade also experienced a slow but decisive development. While political power was decentralized and castles dominated the landscape, new centers of economic and social life were formed in the cities. In the long term, these developments were to form the basis for the urban flourishing in the High Middle Ages. The cities of the West Franconian Empire were remnants of Roman antiquity. Paris, Orleans, Reims, Lyon, or Bordeaux had already been important under the Romans and remained important places in the Carolingian period. But their character had changed. The administrative centers of the empire had become fortified islands in a predominantly rural world. Their population had often shrunk, and many Roman buildings fell into disrepair or were used for new purposes. Nevertheless, the cities were of central importance. They were seats of bishops and thus ecclesiastical centers. In the cathedrals and monasteries of the cities, not only was faith cultivated, but knowledge was also preserved and education imparted. In addition, the cities were markets where farmers from the surrounding area sold their surpluses and craftsmen offered their goods. Trade in the early West Franconian Empire was strongly local. Most markets mainly supplied the respective region. Grain, wine, cattle, salt, wool, and simple tools were among the typical trade goods. Long-distance trade played a lesser role than in antiquity, but had not completely disappeared. Luxury goods such as silk, spices, or precious metals reached West Franconia via the Rhone and the Mediterranean ports, although they were only accessible to a small elite. The trade in salt, which was indispensable for the preservation of food, was of great importance. Salt roads connected the production sites with the cities and shaped the economic areas. Wine was also an important commodity that was consumed domestically as well as exported. The Viking attacks of the 9th century particularly affected the cities on rivers, which were vital for trade and traffic. Paris, for example, was besieged several times, and many traders withdrew in uncertain times. But at the same time, these threats led to cities becoming more fortified and their importance as places of refuge increased. In the long term, a new equilibrium developed. While the countryside remained the economic basis, the cities began to act more strongly as independent actors again. Craft guilds emerged, merchants joined forces, and a new urban self-confidence grew. At first timidly, later with ever greater vigor. The trade routes in the West Franconian Empire were part of larger networks that spanned the whole of Europe. Goods came from Scandinavia and England via the North Sea and the Atlantic. Via the Alps and the Mediterranean, the exchange with Italy and Byzantium took place. Even if the intensity of trade was modest compared to antiquity, these connections formed the seeds of a new economic dynamic. Thus, the development of cities and trade in West Franconia was a process of continuity and new beginnings. The cities kept the heritage of antiquity alive, while new structures of market and crafts emerged. Trade remained limited, but it connected the empire to larger networks. At a time when political unity was disintegrating, cities and trade thus laid the foundation for the economic renewal that was to decisively change the face of Europe in the High Middle Ages.
Chapter 18. Law, Administration, and Feudal Order. The West Franconian Empire was a country in transition, not only politically, but also in its legal and administrative structures. With the collapse of the Carolingian central power and the rise of the local lords, a new order emerged, which we know today as the feudal order. It shaped the social and political life of the empire and determined the relations between kings, nobles, church, and peasants for centuries. In the Carolingian period, there were still beginnings of a unified administration. Counts administered the counties in the name of the king, levied taxes, held court, and led the army. Margraves protected the borders, and royal messengers, the missi dominici, watched over the empire. But these structures quickly disintegrated in the West Franconian Empire. The king could no longer control the counts, and the offices became increasingly hereditary. This transformed administration into a form of local property that was passed down from generation to generation. The law in the West Franconian Empire was based on a mixture of written tribal laws and oral tradition. Even in the Carolingian period, collections of laws such as the Lex Salica, the South Frankish law, had been used. But in everyday life, local customs, judgments of noble courts, and the authority of individual lords played an increasingly important role. There was no uniform legal system. Rather, what had become naturalized or enforced by the local powers applied in each region. In this situation, the feudal system developed. It was based on a clear hierarchy of personal ties. A powerful lord gave a vassal land or income, the fief, and the vassal committed himself to loyalty and service, usually of a military nature, in return. This bond was sealed in solemn rituals by handshake and oath of allegiance. The feudal system was a pragmatic system that created security and order. The king formally stood at the top of the pyramid and was the supreme feudal lord. But in reality, it was the dukes, counts, and margraves who ruled over their vassals as lords. The king was the supreme authority, but his power was often not sufficient to control these structures. The feudal order determined not only the relationships between nobles, but also between lords and peasants. Many peasants were serfs, who were bound to the land and had to pay taxes and services for their master. In return, they received protection, especially in times of Norman invasions and internal wars. Free peasants were increasingly integrated into this system by voluntarily becoming dependent on a master in order to gain security. The church was also part of this order. Bishops and abbots were feudal lords with their own vassals, and monasteries owned large landowners. Some ecclesiastical lords behaved little differently from secular princes. They built castles, waged wars, and bound followers to themselves. The feudal order also shaped the idea of law and justice.
Jurisdiction was not a state monopoly, but was in the hands of the lords. They pronounced justice over their subjects, in which oaths, testimonies, and divine judgments played a major role. The ideal of loyalty was the bond that held the whole system together. The loyalty of the vassal to the lord, but also the loyalty of the lord to the vassal, which meant protection and provision. In this way, an order emerged in the West Franconian Empire that was based on personal ties rather than central authority. This feudal order was flexible, adaptable, and deeply rooted in society. It meant the final farewell to the Carolingian idea of a unified administration, but it laid the foundation for the medieval social structure that was to shape life in France and throughout Europe for centuries.
Chapter 19: The Last Carolingians and the Weakness of Royalty. With the 10th century, the West Franconian Empire entered a phase in which the power of the Carolingians finally declined. While their early rulers were still able to assert a certain authority, the late Carolingians increasingly became pawns in the game of the greats. Their rule was marked by dependence, rivalry, and powerlessness. This epoch shows more clearly than any other how weak the monarchy had become, and why the way was cleared for a new dynasty. After Charles the Simple, who was deposed in 923 and later died in captivity, his descendants tried to maintain the throne. His son Louis IV, who was called from overseas because of his childhood in exile in England, returned to the empire in 936 to claim the crown. But his power depended almost entirely on the greats, especially Hugh the Great, the powerful dupe of the Robertines. Louis was more king by the support of others than by his own strength, and his reign was a constant balancing act between the demands of the nobles and the attacks of external enemies. His son Lothar, 954 to 986, continued this fragile tradition. He tried to gain more independence by interfering in the politics of Lotharingia, but his ventures were unsuccessful. He, too, was dependent on securing the goodwill of the greats and was unable to strengthen royal authority in the long term. The last Carolingian king in the West Franconian Empire was Louis V, who ascended the throne in 986. He was young and inexperienced and ruled only briefly. His nickname, the Lazy One, reflects the judgment of the chroniclers, who did not see him as an active ruler. When he died childless in 987, the Carolingian line in the west finally died out. With the death of Louis V, the empire was at a crossroads. From a purely dynastic point of view, Charles of Lower Lorraine, a relative of the Carolingians, would have had a claim to the crown. But the great men of the empire decided against it. They distrusted Charles because he had close ties to the East Franconian German royal family, and they preferred a ruler they could control, Hugh Capet, the Duke of the Robertines. This ended the rule of the Carolingians in West Franconia, and a new dynasty began. The weakness of the last Carolingians was more than just the failure of individual kings. It reflected a structural change. The monarchy was trapped in a web of dependencies that made it almost impossible to act. The great ones had their own castles, their own armies, their own jurisdiction. The king depended on their loyalty, but this loyalty was often fragile and was only granted in exchange for benefits. At the same time, there was a change in legitimacy. In the past, the crown had of course been associated with the Carolingian dynasty, but in the 10th century this was no longer decisive. Now the big ones decided together who would be king. The election of Hugh Capet was therefore not only a dynastic change, but also an expression of the new balance of power. Royalty was no longer an inviolable inheritance, but a position that depended on the approval of the leading nobles. Thus, with the last Carolingians, a chapter of European history ends. The dream of a united Frankish empire had become an empire marked by internal tensions, regional fragmentation, and weak central power. But it was precisely in this weakness that the opportunity for a new beginning lay. With the Capetians, a new era began, in which the monarchy gradually gained strength, and the West Franconian Empire was transformed into France. Chapter 20: Outlook: From West Franconia to France. With the end of the Carolingians and the election of Hugh Capet in 987, a new era began that gradually transformed the West Franconian Empire into the Kingdom of France. But this transition was not an abrupt event, but a gradual process that took several centuries to complete. To understand how the West Frankish Kingdom became France, one must look back at the developments that shaped the 9th and 10th centuries. The West Franconian Empire had emerged from the division of the Carolingian Empire. It inherited the cultural heritage of the Romans, the institutional structures of the Carolingians, and the challenges of a fragmented society. In its early days, it was characterized by internal struggles, external threats, and the loss of power of kings. But in the midst of these weaknesses, the foundations for later France also emerged. A Romance language that broke away from Latin, a social order based on feudal ties and landlordship, and a church that shaped culture, education, and legitimacy. The Carolingians had not been able to preserve unity. Their power declined because they had to make too many concessions to the greats, because external threats such as the Normans overwhelmed the empire, and because dynastic disputes weakened the monarchy. The Robertines took advantage of this weakness and established themselves as new masters in the empire. With Hugh Capet, this change became official. The monarchy was no longer Carolingian, but Capetian. But even the early Capetians were not powerful rulers. Their authority was limited to the heartland around Paris and Orleans, the Ile-de-France. The large principalities, Aquitaine, Burgundy, Normandy, Brittany, remained largely independent. The king was formally their overlord, but in reality, the dukes and counts dominated their regions. France was not yet a closed kingdom, but a patchwork of rulers loosely connected by personal ties. And yet with Hugh Capet, a decisive step had been taken. For the Capetians knew how to secure the royal dignity hereditarily and to keep it in their family. By crowning their sons co-king during their lifetime, they created a tradition that gave stability to royalty. While other dynasties collapsed, the Capetians gradually expanded their power, laying the foundation for medieval France. In the cultural and social spheres, West Franconia was also on the way to forming a new identity. The Romance dialects developed into Old French, and the first literary testimonies in the vernacular appeared alongside Latin. The Church ensured spiritual unity and preserved the knowledge of antiquity. Cities and trade slowly began to recover, and with the castle system and the feudal order, the social structure that was to characterize the High Middle Ages emerged. The outlook shows that the West Franconian Empire was not an episode of decay, but a phase of transition. It was the time when the foundations for what would later become France were laid. What started out weakly developed into one of the strongest monarchies in Europe through continuity and adaptation. From Charles the Bald to Hugh Capet, from the Norman attacks to the reform movements of the Church, from the fragmentation of power to the reconstruction of the monarchy, all these developments shaped the empire. In retrospect, the West Franconian Empire may seem like an intermediary empire, but in fact, it was the cradle of France. With the election of Hugh Capet, the history of France in the narrower sense began. From the ruins of the Carolingian Empire grew a new kingdom that was to last for centuries. The West Franconian Empire was thus not only a legacy of the past, but also the beginning of a future that would have a decisive influence on Europe.